That day, it began with armor on the horizon. Dozens of Russian tanks and BMPs pushed forward together. Their guns were firing as artillery pounded the fields ahead. The vigorous noise of track grinding, shell explosions, and machine guns shook the ground. However, little did they know, there were keen eyes on those movements. Ukrainian drones were circling above. When the first strike from the opponent landed, the attack began to unravel. What followed demonstrated how modern warfare can render even the heaviest armor vulnerable. It was now about who lived through it. The first hits ripped through the column. Dust and smoke rolled up while vehicles burned. Russian commanders ruthlessly answered with furious barrages. They deployed 2 S-7 heavy artillery units to pound Ukrainian lines and clear a path for the armor. Still, the Russian column moved forward. Tanks and BMPs poured fire into the trenches, which forced Ukrainian soldiers to stay pinned. That was when the Ukrainian M7 opened fire. The round landed close and shook the formation, but the armor held and kept moving. Russian vehicles closed in, forcing Ukrainian troops to deploy anti-tank guided missiles. The first shot missed, raising the stakes as the line advanced toward the trenches. Moments later, Ukrainian artillery adjusted and struck again. This time, the shell found its mark. A Russian tank was hit directly and came to a halt, smoke rising from the impact. Javelin operators then targeted the BMPs carrying infantry. One missile connected, leaving a vehicle badly damaged and spilling troops into cover. Fire from Ukrainian positions intensified as more Russian vehicles marched forward. Then, at a turning point, the lead tank struck a mine and stopped dead in its tracks. That changed the entire narration. The lead vehicle was disabled, and the column behind it slowed. Another tank rolled straight into a mine, leaving the route blocked. The delay mattered for Ukrainian forces. It gave time to regroup, gather intelligence, and redirect fire. Anti-tank groups kept on firing again and again at the armored column. Each strike added to Russian losses. However, despite the damage and the mines, some Russian vehicles broke through. They pushed on toward Ukrainian trenches and brought the battle to the line itself. The tanks at the front fired point blank into Ukrainian defensive lines. Their shells tore through dugouts, forcing soldiers to take cover. BMPs slowed just long enough behind them to unload infantry before pulling back under covering fire. Russian troops, now on foot, spread through the smoke and pushed toward Ukrainian positions. Defenders answered with every weapon at hand. Mortar crews dropped 120mm rounds into the advancing infantry. Those blasts shook the earth and scattered groups that had just left their carriers. Bomber drones circled overhead. They were releasing explosives onto vehicles and troops as they tried to regroup. Inside the trenches, the fight collapsed into close combat. Automatic rifles fired at a near distance. Grenades landed in dugouts already crowded with soldiers. The line, which had moments earlier faced armor, now fought face-to-face engagements with enemy troops. Ukrainian commanders relied on drone feeds to track where the pressure mounted most. That shifted fire support to prevent any breach from widening. The battlefield no longer resembled a column attack. Now it was all messy. Armor was stalled, infantry was locked in trench battles, and drones were circling constantly overhead. But Russian artillery did not stop. Shells exploded dangerously close, which forced both sides into cover. Ukrainian defenders tried to hold their ground, while commanders searched for a way to relieve the pressure. Artillery units received orders to fire on vehicles pulling back from the front. Several were struck as they attempted to regroup, leaving wrecks along the approach route. The exchange widened when Ukrainian reconnaissance drones spotted heavy artillery positions in the rear. Operators identified a 2S7 system, which could fire shells far beyond the front line. Once the coordinates were confirmed, a HIMARS battery launched its strike. The missile hit precisely and set off ammunition, silencing the position. That's when Russian commanders realized their support units were under threat. Air defense crews quickly locked onto a Ukrainian drone that had been providing targeting data. A surface-to-air missile hit, removing the drone and briefly clearing the sky. That duel played out in fragments for Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches. Incoming shells, outgoing fire missions, and the sudden absence of drones determined their position. Russian commanders committed a second armored column. Fresh tanks and BMPs pushed across the fields at full speed, carrying new groups of infantry. Their goal was to break what the first wave could not. Ukrainian units responded even before the formation reached the trenches. BM-21. Grad launchers fired a spread of rockets across the advancing line. One BMP was hit and disabled, its wreck burning in place. The rest of the column kept moving, determined to reach the front. The exchange grew heavier as Russian tanks kept firing to cover the vehicles still moving. Ukrainian defenders answered with concentrated fire, but somehow the pressure built up. Soldiers were already exhausted from the first assault, and given that, another wave felt overwhelming. Drone operators directed Vampire systems toward the new column. One drone struck an APC, halting it before it could unload troops. Even so, several vehicles pressed on and pushed closer to Ukrainian defenses. The trenches once again faced armor at the edge of their line. This was a critical stage for commanders. If the second wave forced a breakthrough, holding the position would become nearly impossible. Ukrainian soldiers prepared themselves, aware that the toughest fighting was still to come. When the second column arrived at the line, the battle took a turn. Tanks stopped at close range and fired into the trenches. The shock of those blasts shook dirt loose from dugout walls. Russian infantry followed in, moving through smoke and broken ground to reach the defenders. Given the situation, there was no distance left for Ukrainians. Grenades landed inside firing positions, while rifles cracked at just a few meters. In places, Russians managed to climb down into the trenches themselves. Soldiers who had been watching drone screens or waiting with launchers now fought face to face, struggling to hold narrow corridors that felt like cages. Commanders tried to follow it on drone feeds. They kept on moving artillery to choke off entry points. Shells landed on the routes behind Russian troops, which eventually slowed reinforcements. However, inside the trenches, defenders had little support. Small groups were cut off. They were fighting alone against waves of infantry pushing forward. Ukrainian drones dropped explosives into areas already packed with Russian troops. Each strike scattered those who survived, which gave defenders a chance to push back. Yet the pressure did not disappear. The fight was now personal for the men holding the line, measured in steps and seconds instead of maps or orders. As fighting raged inside the trenches, Russian commanders tried a new tactic. Another group of tanks and APCs appeared on the flank. Those were hoping to catch the defenders off guard. The move was fast and aggressive indeed. It aimed at breaking through, while the main battle kept Ukrainians pinned. But this time, the defenders had prepared. Artillery batteries immediately changed their aim and opened fire before the vehicles reached firing range. Mine was buried in likely approach routes, adding to the pandemonium. A tank rolled straight into one, which blocked the narrow path and halted those behind it. Drone operators launched FPV strikes against the stalled column. One after another, the drones found targets. A BMP erupted in flames, and an APC spun to the side and stopped moving. Those sudden flank attacks began to fall apart within minutes. Ukrainian soldiers could see the wrecks burning on the horizon. The attempted maneuver, which might have collapsed their position, instead turned into another trap. There was little room to recover for Russian crews. Vehicles jammed the approach, while operators watched drones circling overhead. The chance to surprise the defense was gone, replaced by mounting losses and a retreat that looked more like escape. By the time the flank attack collapsed, the assault had lost momentum. Russian infantry, still inside the trenches, found themselves cut off. Their armor was either destroyed or retreated under fire. There were hardly any vehicles left to shield them, hence the fight turned into survival. Ukrainian drones kept circling constantly and dropping grenades on dugouts and pathways where Russian troops tried to regroup. On the other hand, vampire drones targeted fortified spots that had offered shelter only minutes earlier. Each strike left fewer places to hide. The pressure eased for the first time in hours for defenders. Artillery switched from holding fire to hammering retreat routes. Every movement across the open ground risked being caught. Russian soldiers began pulling back in small groups, carrying wounded and abandoning equipment. Ammunition shortages deepened their problems. Units that had pushed furthest forward struggled to return fire. Some held on in shell craters, waiting for orders that never came. Others ran across exposed fields, chased by drone cameras recording their retreat. In the end, what began as a massive armored push ended in scattered fragments of men and machines. Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches knew the line had held. For the attackers, the cost was evident in wrecks and the bodies left behind. But war writes a new chapter every day. What do you think this battle shows about modern warfare? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to follow the next clash before it makes headlines.